Our final speaker tonight is Rod Simpson. He's the Environment Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission. He's an architect, an urban designer, and now an adjunct professor at UTS. Rod's work has spanned planning and urban design and energy efficiency. It's working with all three levels of Australian governments, which in my book deserves a special award now that I'm trying to do that myself. He's here tonight to tell us more about new architecture and directions and opportunities right here in Sydney. Please welcome Rod.
Is this working? Yes, good.
Yep.
Thanks, Beck. So, look, I'm going to get straight into it. There's going to be a repeat. I think one of the things that struck me over the last 18 months with resilience is that it's a pretty vague concept, and it's actually only through these sorts of discussions that it starts to become embedded in the way we think about things. So there'll be a bit of a repeat. Rob talked about intuitive responses to disasters, and that's probably that all was possible in 1867, the Great Nepean Flood. A lot of people lost their lives. If you look at the trend in mortality across Australia, this is the whole of Australia, you can see things are generally improving. They're improving because there's better understanding, there's better emergency services in place and so forth. In other words, there's better formal responses to some of these risks and hazards. For example, with the Hawkesbury Nepean, we understand very well how those river systems will behave. These are the escape routes that are mapped out, carefully sequenced to when roads are cut to make sure that people can get out. You can see why it's such an issue over there on the left. Unlike most river systems which have what's called a possible maximum flood, the big black line, up in most rivers, they're a little bit higher. In the Hawkesbury Nepean, in that area, it's 9 metres higher because there's a constriction in the river. I'm showing that because we can understand risk. We can actually model this. This is essentially like understanding the way we design for peak loads of any sort. It can be predicted to a certain extent in terms of risk. That risk, of course, translates into dollar impacts. It translates into, as you can see here, the variety. We've got the full spread of disasters in Australia. Earthquake, not so much, when you rely on New Zealand for that. But in what we've got here, though, you can see that even the earthquake, though it's very rare, is actually one of the major events from an insurance point of view, from the cost of that initial impact. But, of course, as has already been pointed out, it's actually the ongoing impact that we need to be concerned about. And that ongoing impact isn't going to be covered by insurance only by those formal structures. What's going to happen is that there's got to be a build-up in the capacity for our entire community to respond. And the insurance companies know this. There's Munich Re over there, there's Deloitte looking at the Business Roundtable on resilience and disaster preparedness, and over here on the right is basically showing the numbers of, yes, the tangible, the direct impacts, the flooded house, the plasterboard that's come off, the deaths and injuries, but look at the grey area. That's the psychological stress, the mental health impacts, the impact on social cohesion and on economy long term. So the insurance industry is interested in that because, of course, those things also then affect their business. It affects the entire country's ability to respond to disaster. And it's well understood, is my point. And the point I'm making is that there's a limit to the formal responses that we can mount in anticipation and in response to these disasters. Now, when you look at the projected cost of that, you can see over here on the right, we're going from $10 billion up to around about 25, some say $33 billion, and that sounds like a total disaster. Right? It's a big increase. But if you look at the increase in the economy, a strange thing can be noticed there. It actually is relatively smaller on rough figures, but basically staying as the same proportion of the growth relative to the growth in the economy. One problem with those figures, and it's not shied away from in that report, this doesn't include climate change. Okay? So in other words, this is a graphing of risk. It's not a graphing of uncertainty. And yet everything we've heard previously is talking about what's the compounded risk that comes from the things that we can't predict. So we need to distinguish risk from uncertainty. And what I want to do in this little 15 minutes is talk about the possible linkage between a risk framework, a way of conventionally planning the city, and one that's actually dealing with an uncertainty, not only in terms of disaster preparedness, but uncertainty as something that we contend with in design. So Beck's talked about this, and what you can see here is the shocks and stresses. I don't need to go into this much more, I don't think, except to say that there's a very important proposition, if you like, put here, a fundamental proposition in the 100 Resilience Cities work. These are not empty words. There's a causality buried in there that says it's concerned with the stresses and the acute shocks. It's concerned as much with the adaptive capacity as it is with the formal responses. It's concerned with the capacity of the whole society, the social cohesion that Beck's already talked about. That's the fundamental basis. And if we rely purely on emergency responses and hard engineering, you've seen what happened in New Orleans. It doesn't work because we can't predict it to be effective. So I want to talk a little bit more in detail about, about heat, which has come up. This is a mapping of Parramatta, as you can see, compared to Sydney as a trend line going up. We know it causes death. This is the deaths increase in 2009 in Melbourne. And there's nothing new about this, right? We've got to understand that extreme heat, we've already got a climate which is at a large scale. There's hot air coming off the centre of the continent. There's cold air coming from the northeast on the eastern side of the city, stopping about Parramatta. But what we've got now is that climate overlaid by climate change, overlaid by the urban heat island effect. In fact, what we're actually building in the city. You put those three together and you've got an increase in vulnerability. Now this, I'm not going to dwell on all these technical diagrams, they're not that technical, but what this really shows is it's the relationship between the exposure to the hazard combined with the sensitivity of the population. That's going to vary across the city. It's specific to a particular event. The adaptive capacity, which is actually the ability of people to respond, which is really what combined means that we've got vulnerability. So just looking at what happens in Sydney, here's the heat. The sensitivity in the case of heat is generally young children under the age of 5, people over 85. They're the sensitive population. When we start to talk about adaptive capacity, though, we're talking about the capacity of that community to respond. That's largely to do with social disadvantage, right? Why is that coming in with heat? Well, social disadvantage might mean that you can't afford to own and run an air conditioner. So there's the mapping of vulnerability. That's Fairfield, basically, that red circle, where people are basically doing it tough, and at the same time, they're the ones who are exposed to the extreme heat. And we might then look at, say, Canopy and say, well, the obvious thing to do is plant more trees, because it's quite clear from here that they could do with a few more trees in Fairfield. Trees take 20 years to grow, so that's probably not going to be the immediate solution. The slides have gone from black to white, which is, I think, what happened to you, Rob. But what this shows is a relationship between Canopy and this has disappeared over here, I do apologise, but what you see here is that with an increase in Canopy, you actually get a reduced temperature. So it would seem like an easy thing to do to say, let's plant more trees. This is what we're building at the moment. That's that compounding of climate in the city, plus climate change, plus the urban heat island effect. Now, the government has already said that we're going to be changing the code and requiring a tree in the front and a tree in the back, which is great. That's the current condition in that place. Now, the reason I'm showing it is that we do want to plant more trees, and we will. However, let's look at another area in Fairfield. Over here you have Orphan School Creek, and I'm going to be talking about these two areas in the two circles. Orphan School Creek has been restored. This is a wonderful project which actually turned that channel 20 years ago into this wonderful environment. It takes 20 years though. But it was achieved through a lot of community participation. It involved people. The reason there's no trees in that street is probably because that particular group of people aren't particularly enamoured of trees. So for us to come in and say, thou shalt plant trees, is probably not going to be an effective policy. So we can do the analysis, we can do the top-down suggestions, but it's going to rely on processes like 100 Resilient Cities to go out and engage with that community, getting the community involved, which is not only a product out of that process, but the process itself will be one of the things that will generate discussion and hopefully build community cohesion. So resilience is about building that capacity. It's both a product and a process. So it's not going to be easy to actually reforest Fairfield, is my point. The other thing is, as I said before, really for the extreme heat, the critical thing is if you haven't got a neighbour looking after you and looking out for you, which is what happened in Paris in 2003, thousands of people died from extreme heat in 2003 in Paris. Why? They were largely old, as I've already touched on. The critical thing was it was during holiday season. Most of their families had gone on holidays to the south of France. They were left alone. That's why so many people died. So those social networks are absolutely critical. At a metro scale, what we're trying to do at the Greater Sydney Commission is make sure that there's more opportunity in the west of the city. Part of that is about building the economy, of course, but also building social capacity. That's why we've talked about the 3 cities. There's a great emphasis on improving a whole lot of things in the west. I'm going to clip through this quickly. But that big macro scale needs to be accompanied by an understanding of the micro scale. How on earth do you do that at the scale of the city? If we think about self-organisation back in 1867, this is a very few diagrams just to tease out a point. The self-organisation that we'd expect in a community has been formalised through institutions, through banking arrangements and so forth, through emergency services. We've come to rely on that. So we've got a top-down system that's actually pretty good in Australia. But what we've seen with the insurance companies is we can't simply rely on a top-down process. And in making that top-down process effective, we've come to rely on it, and through relying on it, we've actually created vulnerability in itself. You've got to have what Rob referred to as redundancy. You've got to have backup systems. You've got to have multiple ways of operating, which seems inefficient, but it's more resilient. So what you can see I'm getting at here is that there's actually a tension here between the idea of a functional city and a resilient city. It's a different set of parameters. It's, as Elizabeth has said, it's largely refocusing on social capacity. It's putting people front and centre in terms of the way that we approach planning. I better keep on going, I'm getting the wind up from... So that concentration is accompanied at the same time, because we've relied on those formal arrangements, there's a fragmentation at this level. That fragmentation is what I'm talking about in Paris, right? So what we've got is almost a dual system. That fragmentation is, and at this scale, and at the central scale, of course, it results in silos. Again, this is where if we're talking about place and communities, we've actually got to have a cross-cutting sort of strategy. To plant those trees in Fairfield is going to involve multiple government departments, multiple levels of government, and multiple agencies to be involved. Cross-cutting. And in doing that, what we're talking about is concentrating on precincts or place. How the hell do we understand that at the city scale? We talk about the mosaic of the city. The way we do it is to actually model the city, get the data, and understand, and I'm using carbon modelling here as an example. This shows where it's going to be most effective to have policy to achieve improved carbon. It's different in different places. In a high-performance, low-carbon precinct, what you can see here is that this is, over here, this is in the renewal areas. A major part of it's to do with electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles having a huge potential impact. Very different to what you might do out in the west. The reason I'm showing this is not to talk about the carbon so much, but to say that what we've got to aim for is understanding the detail, the particular problems that exist in particular places, like Fairfield, and still be able to understand it from the top-down and formal understanding of the city. And we've also got to understand, why do we do that? Because And this is again just to illustrate a concept of what is a system. And it's only by thinking about places in all their complexity that we can deal with that complexity, but not be overwhelmed by the scale of it. We can deal with complexity in place. And this is just chasing through the complexity, if you like, of the system, of what the impact might be when you combine electric cars with the autonomous vehicles with no on-street parking. You see what I'm saying? The complexity that's here might apply to a particular part of the city, and that's why it's so important to concentrate on place. And then we can assemble those places and understand the entire city. That's a data issue. It's not the way that we manage the city necessarily. You need both. You need the top-down as well as the bottom-up, which is the accumulation of places. And so, we can look overseas. When we think about place, we can start to think, well, if we're going to have, are we going to really need much parking when there's autonomous vehicles? Probably not. Well, wouldn't it be a good idea to build a dedicated parking area that is actually a prime waterfront location that's probably going to be demolished in 10 years? Right, so this is starting to think about the adaptive capacity at a precinct scale or at a place scale. What about how do we transfer it in Sydney? How do we transfer it in Sydney? If you look at what's happened, say, in King's Cross, which was until recently the densest suburb in the city, how did it come to be like that? Picking on what Rob said, it didn't actually have a lot of rules. What it had was a very resilient, robust framework, which is actually the street and the grain of the subdivision. That's what allowed that to actually iterate and intensify over 200 years. Canberra. And we'll finish on Canberra, my favourite place. Why am I talking about Canberra? Because you might think that it is the perfect example of a place that was designed, planned, built. Of course, that's when they're still looking for the site. There's Burley Griffin. That's what it turned into. And the conception in the 1970s when it was designed was there was the drawing, and then you can see it was simply built pretty much. Job over, finished, our work is done, move on. But if we think about the challenges that then face Canberra, which is accommodating population growth, putting in new transport and so forth, the irony is that that perfect design, which actually put in so much surface car parking, you can see it all over there, not intended, is actually where the adaptive capacity is for 50% of the houses in the future. My point is this: if we look back at King's Cross, if we look over to the continent and look at what is going on in Denmark, if we look at Canberra and then think, well, hang on, we can see that by doing that, by having that redundancy, by having that space left over, by not trying to be super efficient, we can actually then have a capacity at an urban scale to accommodate change and shifts in economy and social expectations, and of course, what we need to do in response to climate. And so you can see here, this is the amount of existing built form and surface car parking. Those areas are going to accommodate 50% of Canberra's growth. What are we going to do in the west of Sydney? So the challenge here is to not do it historically, but look back on that experience and now to consider this new approach of resilience as being a guiding set of principles. Adaptive capacity, redundancy in terms of infrastructure capacity, but redundancy in governance as well is what we're talking about. Formal and informal systems, bottom-up and top-down processes. Sounds inefficient, but now we're interested in resilience, not necessarily hyper-efficiency. Hyper-efficiency is also very fragile. Fragility means it's vulnerable, right? If you're trying to get the last percentage out of a system, you're really risking a lot. So there we are, that's the last slide. So I think what I've tried to do is to paint a bit of a picture, I suppose, of how resilience principles might be related to some of the things that we revalue in urbanity, across to some of those principles then embedded in planning practice. And I think that's our greatest challenge. How do we now go from what is emerging as a new way of thinking, a new way of prioritising the way we make decisions in an urban context, and starting to build it into our professional practice, our governance, the way we engage with communities. I'll leave it at that.